Welcome to John Teaches Sean About His Brain, the podcast where I, Sean, embark on a journey to understand what's happening in my own head. Spoiler alert, I have no clue, but that's precisely why we're here. In each episode, I explore questions about the brain that I believe will resonate with all of us. Like, why can't I turn my brain off at 3 a.m.? Why my memory only works when it feels like it, and why my brain seems to betray me when I need it most. Listen, I'm not a scientist. I'm no expert. I'm just a guy looking to unravel the mysteries of my own mind. Fortunately, I happen to know a cognitive neuroscientist who is an expert in the brain, and I get to ask him all the questions I want. So, if you're curious, confused, or simply along for the ride, welcome. And hey, if you like what you hear, don't forget to like, follow, subscribe to the podcast, or whatever it is you do wherever you listen to podcasts. I don't know how the algorithms work. I just know that your support keeps this journey moving forward. And together, we might just discover something remarkable. This is John Teaches Sean About His Brain. Let's get started. Hi, John. It's good to see you.
Hey, Sean. Good to see you.
So I have to ask, as I do every week, what's on your mind this week?
Well, I have a personal story to tell, if that's okay.
That would be great.
So last week, we have an acquaintance that raises pigs. And we usually buy a half of a pork from him, and he sends his pig to the butcher, and then we connect with the butcher shop and pick it up when it's ready. So last week was the half of the pork was ready for us to pick up, and my daughter, who's a high school English teacher in close to where the butcher shop is, she just stopped by and they loaded it into her car and she brought it home. So I was unloading this pork, and we had two large coolers, and then they had put the pork in the coolers, and then there were a couple of red bags. It's like a 50-gallon trash bag, except it's even thicker, and it's a red color that's really thick plastic, but it's a bag, and they loaded it with pork and then tied it at the top. But you know how if you have a bag, your trash bag, you'll tie it across from each other, you'll put a little knot, and then you'll take the opposite side and tie that little knot. So you have like four corners brought in, but there's still kind of some gaps around it. But I just picked up those knots and brought it in, and we were just getting ready to eat dinner when my daughter delivered it to us. And so our deep freeze is in the basement. And so I brought the bag in and set it in the kitchen. And I told Casey, I said, I'm just going to set this in the kitchen and let's have dinner because it's frozen solid. Let's have dinner and then we can load everything into the deep freeze. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, why don't you just leave it on the porch because it's below freezing outside? I went, oh, yeah, it's like 20 degrees outside. So I thought that's even better. Then it's just going to stay frozen. So I put the two coolers and the two red bags on our porch right by our door. And I should mention that we live a few miles outside of town on a few acres, and there's a few neighbors close by, but regularly we see deer, coyotes, bobcats, possums, just wildlife around. And so we're aware of wildlife, but they don't really come near the house that often. So I thought, well, it's going to be fine because it's only going to be there for, 30 to 45 minutes, maybe max. So I'm not worried about coyotes coming up to our porch in that amount of time. Plus it's frozen. I'm not sure they can smell it yet till it starts to thaw out. So I wasn't really worried about it. So we have a couple of boxers, dogs, that during the meal, we always gate them in a room away from the table so they can't come bother us around the table. So they were gated. We had dinner. We laughed and talked. And when it was over, I said, you know what? I'm going to leave the boxers locked away in the room while I carry the pork down to the basement, and then we can let them out. And so I went out on the porch. I picked up the first red bag, and one of the lids from the cooler, when they had stuffed some stuff down in it, it had popped off, so it was separate. So I just picked up the lid and the red bag and brought him into the house. I was going to give the lid to Casey to take care of, and then I was going to go get the rest of the pork and bring it in. And then once it was in the house, I was going to carry it downstairs. And when I set the red bag down on the floor and started to hand her the lid, and in this room was Casey and Sierra and me, and the dogs were gated in a side room, but it's a child's gate, so you can see through it. So they were watching.
So the door's open. They can see.
They can see all of it.
Okay.
But they're quarantined off.
Mm-hmm.
I set the bag down, and as I turned to Casey to hand her the lid, the bag rattled a little bit. And then all of a sudden, out of this bag came this big fur ball, really slowly coming out of the bag. And I was standing like right next to it. And I've thought about this many times looking back on it. This just happened 4 days ago. But I sat and I looked at it and I couldn't figure out what was happening. It was like I was frozen and I just stood and watched. And actually we all did. Like Casey and Sierra, they just stood. They didn't say anything. And our dogs just stood and looked. They didn't make a peep. And
the dogs too.
The dogs too. All of us just stopped and looked. And this big furry thing came out. And thinking back, right after it happened, I was thinking, is that a squirrel? But it was so much bigger than a squirrel. I was like, that can't be a squirrel, because I was behind it. And as it came out onto the floor, this long, hairless tail was following it. And my first thought was rat, but that was just way too big to be a rat. And about that time, Casey was standing to the side where she could see it. And she went, "It's a possum." And that dumb thing crawled out slowly and just waddled. I don't know if you've seen possum.
I've seen them.
Yeah.
Yes.
It just kind of waddled back and forth from our dining room into the family room. And we all stood and watched it.
It's in your house.
In the house. And it did a slow walk. And none of us said anything or did anything until it got into the family room. And then all of a sudden, the dogs just went crazy, and I was like, what just happened? Because I couldn't process it. I literally couldn't process what was happening. And so I grabbed, there was a blanket close by. I grabbed the blanket. Casey said, it went under the chair, the recliner in our family room. So I went in there. Our Christmas tree's in there. So all I'm thinking about is Christmas vacation with the squirrel hitting the tree,
with the
going
squirrel
over the table. Yeah, and if our dogs, if they would have already been out, I'm afraid it would have been a bloodbath in there, because it would have been really bad.
Yeah.
But they were still locked up. So this possum goes under the chair, and I take the blanket in, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I can throw a blanket over it and then carry it out the front door or what. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with it. And off of our family room, we have a door that goes outside, and the recliner is right by that door that goes outside. And I'm going in trying to figure out how I'm going to get the possum and bring it back through our family room, through the dining room, to the front door and out, when Casey said, "Oh, good, it's right by the door. You can just shoo it out the back door." And I'm like, oh yeah, that's an even better plan. Way better.
Well, I'm just glad that in this scenario, someone had their wits about them. Someone had their brain working.
Casey's brain was working. Mine wasn't. So I moved the chair, and she said it ran under the couch. So now the couch leads over to the Christmas tree. So I'm trying to put a blanket around to block it from the Christmas tree and to block it from coming in the main part of the room. And then I've got to pull the couch back, and it's right by the door. I've got to pull the couch back, but I don't want to stick my hands under the couch to lift it. So on the arm of it, where the cloth is sewn on, there's a bead of just kind of a round bead all the way around that outlines the arm of it. If you can kind of picture that.
Yeah.
It's just a little round piece of cloth that's kind of where everything's sewed together. I was picking it up with my fingers, trying to hold it to pick the couch up by that little bead of cloth to lift it and slide it, because I had to come up over a carpet, slid it out, finally got it. and opened the door and kind of stomped around on the opposite side of the door and got it waddling towards the door. And it was, I think, as happy as I was to see the open door. And but it waddled on out. It never scrambled. It never ran. It didn't hiss. Sometimes possums will, if you try to approach them, they'll hiss really loud and, say back off. Didn't do any of that. It acted like it knew where it was going, like it had been in the house before. It's like, I'll just go in the family room, crawl up on the couch, prop my feet up. Hey, can you bring me a sandwich?
Casually take a tour of the family room. And,
yes.
Yeah.
So then thinking back to that, I was just thinking about schemas and how schemas help you understand things really quickly. And I was at such a loss because I have no schema for a possum in the house. It's the first time a possum's ever been in the house. Like if it would have been a mouse, I have schemas for that. I would have immediately said, oh, there's a mouse. I know what to do. This big furry thing was crawling out. And I just sat there and was like, I don't know what's happening right now. And we all did. Even the dogs were like, yeah, I don't have schema for this either. So we all just watched this possum crawl out and waddle through our house.
So real quickly, just briefly, but what's going on in the brain when you're frozen? You don't have a schema. There's there's nothing for you to pick out. What's your brain doing in that moment?
Yeah. So the back channel, if you remember our terms from the last episode, the on channel and the back channel. The on channel is the conscious, aware brain, and the back channel is the non-conscious, everything going on that you're not aware of, that the brain is doing. And the non-conscious is where there's patterns and schemas, and it pushes forward thoughts and behaviors to help you know what you should do in certain situations. And it was like, yeah, I got nothing right now. And it kind of froze. If there's a novel situation, you've heard of the fight, flight, freeze.
Something
I know you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yep. Because being in law enforcement, the fight, flight, freeze. So it was kind of frozen because it's novel, it's new, and I don't know what's the best option right here. I don't have anything to rely on. I can't go back to a past experience or something we've learned. So I'm just freezing. I literally just stood there and watched everything happen. And it's not like I chose to stand and watch. I didn't know what was happening. So it wasn't pushing forward, oh, this is a mouse, you've got to do this or that. It was just, and my on channel it couldn't figure out what to do. My back channel was like, yeah, let's just freeze. I've got nothing. So it was wild to experience that.
That is a wild story, but it's a great illustration of just how the brain works or sometimes doesn't work. Because like you said, in law enforcement, we talk a lot about fight, flight, freeze, but I don't know that in my experience that we really have that many examples of freeze. When you're really under enough stress, that there's it's a lot of, they're going to run or they're going to fight, right? When they hit that point. But yeah, that's interesting because I brought up stress and the like. So I wanted to ask you about how stress affects the two channels that you mentioned, the on channel and the back channel. And so if we can dig into that a little bit, I was thinking back, and I don't have I think you know me well enough, I don't have a very good memory. But when we talk about memory, this is really going to be interesting for me because there's some events in my life that I remember like they were this morning. There's certain parts, at least I think I do, because we're going to get into that part too. But when I was pretty new in law enforcement, I mean, this was almost 25 years ago. And I worked for a large metropolitan agency, a big agency. And I don't actually remember, there's parts of it I don't remember, but I was riding in the car with another officer. So we were a 2-officer car, which was very rare. Normally we work alone in a car, but on this day, for whatever the reason was, and the other officer was actually driving the vehicle. I wasn't driving. So even less for me to do in this scenario. So we see a crime actually being committed, what I believe to be a crime being committed in another vehicle. So we get behind the vehicle, initiate a stop, turn on the overhead lights. Anybody who's been stopped by the police kind of knows what this looks like in the rearview mirror. But, we turn the lights on, hit the whoop of the siren to let them know. And they don't pull over. Instead, they gun it. They take off. They run. So now we're in a vehicle pursuit. And the crime that initiated this stop was enough that we could pursue this vehicle. So we're pursuing the vehicle. It's during the day, by the way. So a lot of traffic, a lot of vehicles, and we're pursuing this vehicle at pretty high rates of speed through intersections. It's pretty stressful. But I'm not driving. So when I'm not driving, my job is I'm in charge of communication. So I'm connecting with dispatch. I'm connecting with other units and so forth. And this other officer, who's a good driver, by the way, is just driving their heart out, right? So we get to a point, and it's pretty stressful. And I find this out later, but I'm communicating on the radio our location, our speeds, our direction. I'm trying to get other officers set up. I'm on the radio constantly, but our supervisor, who is technically in charge of this pursuit, even though they're not there with us, radios and asks me, what is the crime? What's the reason for the pursuit? And I never answer that question. Now, I will tell you here, sitting here, neither of us heard that question come over the radio. And the problem, what would later turn out to be somewhat of a problem, is that the very next thing that came over the radio, dispatch asked something and I answered it. So we conclude this pursuit. The vehicle, he pits the vehicle, and the guy gets out and runs on foot. There's a foot chase. It's a crazy thing. So it's all over. And at the end, we have this big debrief, like we do with calls like this. We all get together and talk about what we did right, what we did wrong. And in my experience, almost every debrief ends the same way: better communication, more training. But that's a side note for another. That's a note for another day. And so then at the end of all of it, we in the car, but me specifically, come under scrutiny because I ignored the supervisor's question, which later the supervisor and other administrators said if we would have answered the question, they would have terminated the pursuit. So it looked like, it appeared to them that I intentionally ignored that question and not answering it because we wanted to stay in the pursuit. And 25 years later, my life experience now, looking back, I understand how someone could believe that. But being in the moment, being the person responsible for communication, I'm air quotes are implied here, but I never heard that question. And so I've long wondered what happened to me. So I feel like this is another time where I can ask, why did my brain betray me?
Yeah, no, that is, there's probably people who've experienced something similar, even if you're not a police officer. So I believe you that you didn't hear it. And the reason I'm saying that is because I've actually done research on this very thing that you're talking about. So let me tell you about a research story that it actually sounds eerily similar to what you're saying. So I was, researching the brain, how it processes information, especially under stress, to say, how does it change what it's doing? And there's already been a lot of research. It's not like I was the first one to do this, but I was wanting to do something a little bit differently. I use the electroencephalograph as a tool, so the EEG, which you can connect sensors or electrodes to the scalp of the head, and you can measure brain activity to see what the brain is doing during certain tasks and things like that. So I was wanting to. Sorry, just measure,
one. Is that like a cap that you put on the head, or do you actually like attach? How do you attach the wires to the brain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can do it different ways.
Okay.
A lot of times, if you're just looking for like a certain type of measurement for just like visual stimuli or auditory stimuli, you can just connect one or two electrodes. There's a paste you can have, so you clean off an area on the scalp, and you have this little paste, and it's an electrode, and you put this paste in it, and you just push it down on the scalp and put a little cotton ball on the top of it, and just hold it down, and it just sticks on the head, and it measures activity underneath. But you can also buy caps where you pull the cap over somebody's head, and fasten it on. And that's actually what I was using. I had a cap with 40 electrodes in it because I was looking at, the entire brain, like all areas of the brain activity, so I could get a little bit better idea of where things were happening and when they were happening. And I wanted to do this in field research in a live scenario, and I was wanting to do it with driving. And I had a colleague who said, you should contact the Metropolitan Police in London in the UK, because their driver training program, they train, they have closed courses as well, but they also train with the general public where they drive at high speeds, practicing pursuits with the general public. So they chase each other among traffic as part of their training. And nobody does that here in the US. And so you
No.
can.
So there are, during police training, there are at least two vehicles on the streets of London chasing each other as part of a training for pursuit driving. Is that accurate?
Yes, for response driving and pursuit driving.
Yeah, but pursuit driving is the one I'm interested in based just on my story, but also just my experience. I can't speak for all law enforcement in this country, but I can't imagine any agency allowing this. Just we're going to just do pursuit training through the streets of Phoenix or whatever. You pick your city, but they do that in London.
Yeah, I don't think that
That's
insurance
incredible.
companies would allow that.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead. They do the training on the streets of London.
Yeah, and the two cars, each one has an instructor and 3 students. So you have 6 students being trained with 2 instructors in 2 cars. And so they'll
just out in the wild.
One car will chase each other through London. They might drive over to Wales and have lunch. And then the other car, the one that was pursuing, becomes the rabbit car, and it gets chased all the way back to London.
Okay.
So
it sounds fun.
They stop every little bit and trade drivers. It was fun. And for our, so I was wanting to do research with them, and I'll cut ahead just to say they allowed for a certain number of classes coming through. They restricted it, instead of 3 students per car, it was 2 students per car, which left an open seat behind the driver and the back seat behind the driver. And they allowed me to put a 40 channel electrode cap on the driver. And then I hooked it into a portable EEG system that was hooked into, it ran off my laptop's battery. So I had a laptop in the back with the battery, and I was recording brain activity while they were driving at high speeds, 130, 140 miles an hour, in and around London and out in the country, chasing each other. So it was.
Okay, hang on. Sorry. You got to paint this picture. So you are in the back seat of one of these vehicles with a laptop with 40 wires running to the driver of a vehicle who's wearing a cap and driving at over 100 miles an hour on the streets of London. That's what you're describing right now.
On the highways. On the streets, they followed speed limits and then got
on the highway.
Yeah.
But you are in a vehicle with a laptop on your lap, and the driver has a cap with wires coming off it going to the back seat. And we're driving on the highway at over 100 miles an hour. That's what you're describing.
Yeah, and just a couple things. If they have to slam on brakes, or if God forbid, there's a crash, you don't want a laptop and an EEG to be projectiles in the car taking people's heads off. So we actually built a harness to hold the laptop and the EEG behind the seat. So it was kind of locked into place. And it's still kind of set on my lap, but it was locked into the seat, tightly into the seat where it wouldn't move from the seat. And then the second thing I should mention is they weren't driving the old Crown Victorias that are like ships on the road that just, like some of the training vehicles with driving over here in the States with police. They were driving Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis. And
as police vehicles.
Yes, as pursuit vehicles.
As pursuit vehicles.
As pursuit vehicles and as training vehicles. So and I said to them at one point, because I noticed just things I was looking at, like the tires always look like they just come out of the shop like brand new. So I just said to them at one point, I said, how often do you change the tires on your vehicles? And they said about every 4,000 miles. And I said, no, not the oil, the tires. And they said, yeah, the tires about every 4,000 miles. I'm like, what? That's not hardly any. And they said, if there is an accident, we don't want it to be equipment failure, because then that's what, if we have bad a tire blows, or if we're driving vehicles that can't handle high speeds or turning or whatever, then that's equipment failure. So we want to be sure that the equipment is never the issue. And then we can train.
That's the one thing you're in control of,
yes,
right? Is having good, proper equipment that you're in control of.
Yeah. And I'll say this, sitting in the back seat of a BMW or a Mercedes or Audi, driving at high speeds in a car that's really tight like that and really sleek, it feels like you're doing about 70 or 80. So I was thinking, when I first heard it, I thought, man, this is going to be kind of harrowing and nerve-wracking to ride in a car driving that fast on the M5 or wherever we're at. And it actually wasn't. There was never a time where I was like, oh my goodness, I'm scared right now. And part of that's because to get to that point, officers are already so far into their career, because they only select a few of the best officers to even get to the point of becoming a pursuit driver. So it's highly selective. And if you fail, you never get a second chance to try again. So it's like a one-shot deal, because they feel like if you don't pass that first time, then they're not going to spend more training money on you because you might not pass the second time. So they're going to give that next person the opportunity.
Right.
So saying all of that, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to measure brain activity in a car at high speed. So to do that, and you come from a law enforcement background, I come from an academic background, and those two are sometimes at odds. I don't know if you know that or not, but
you could say that.
Not every police officer likes professors. Yeah. And not every professor respects police officers. So there's kind of a tension there. And, and with reason. So when I approach law enforcement to do research with them, I know there's that moment of, oh boy, what are you wanting to research and why? And then what are you going to publish afterwards? Because if you publish to say, wow, your training really stinks, then now the agency that I research with is going to have fallout. And so I secured the funding to do the research, and I secured permission from the driving school over in the UK to do the research, but I needed the London Met administrators to say it's okay. And initially they said, no, you cannot do the research here. So I asked if I could meet with them. We could have a meeting and I could just describe what I was wanting to do and why. And so they said yes. So I traveled over and went to New Scotland Yard, to their main office there. And I had a contact there, really great guy. His name is Dave Bloxage, that was with them at the time, and he was with the Federation. I think he was a special agent, different things. Really great guy that was helping me. And I shouldn't admit this, but I hate to say it. When he picked me up to take me to the New Scotland Yard and we got ready to walk in, he said, "I need your passport to show to get you in." I was like, "Oh, I left it locked up in the hotel. I was scared I would lose it. I don't have my passport with me." He's like, "What? You can't get into New Scotland Yard?
New Scotland Yard. Yes. You just want to waltz into New Scotland Yard
without an ID. Just let me
without in. ID. Yeah.
It was bad, and they had to go through the. Everybody was like, "No, he can't come in." He's like, "Okay, you don't understand. This is an absent-minded professor. He's not real bright. He does stupid stuff like this all the time. Can you just cut him a break?" And they were like, "No." But eventually I got in. I met in a room with about 12 of the assistant commanders and public information officer and different ones, and gave a short presentation about what I was wanting to research and why. And they, the response from them was, "Well, we're just concerned that, if you publish something that hurts us, whatever." And I said, "I get
it's going to make us, you're going to do something or publish something to make us look bad."
Yeah, that was their fear, which I
Yeah,
understand.
me
And
too.
so, yeah, so they said, we'll let you do it if you submit any research you do for publication to us first and let us approve it. And I said, well, as a scientist, I can't do that because I have a professional obligation to other scientists, to other people, that when I do research, I have to share it. And I know there's exceptions to that because I've gone into situations where I've known ahead of time that there's some really, classified things that I can't share. But this would just be looking at cognitive processes under stress. And that's something that I wanted to share. So finally we hit at, how about if I show you anything that I'm going to publish before I publish it, in case there's something in it that you want your PR group to get ahead of, then you can be ahead of it before it's released. And they said, okay, we'll do that. Because I told them I'm not here to evaluate your training. That was their main fear. I'm not here to
Right.
evaluate your training. I'm here to look at brain processes. And so one of the things I threw in is, how about if I let you, is there something that you've wondered about that you don't have an answer for, that maybe research would help you figure out this issue? Because if there's something you're wondering about, maybe I could add that into my research plan and answer a question that you're interested in as well. And one of the assistant commissioners said, yes, I have something that relates to driving. You're wanting to research at the driving school. He said, we have a policy over here that as a pursuit is underway, that at a command center, the command center is listening to the officers that are driving the same situation you just gave me with you and
Mm-hmm.
your partner. And then they're
Sounds familiar.
deciding why are you pursuing this person? What was the crime? And then they have to, there's a supervisor at the command center that's responsible for deciding if that pursuit should go on or not. And if they think, this really isn't worth the risk, then they had a policy. They would say, terminate the pursuit, terminate the pursuit. They say it twice. And
Mm-hmm.
then the officer, upon hearing that, is supposed to immediately let off the accelerator, turn on their left blinker, and make the first left turn they can make, because they're driving on the wrong side of the road over there. So it'd be like us making a
Thank you
right
for that,
turn.
because that threw me. Left turn. I was like, what? In my head, I was like, why would you turn into oncoming traffic? Yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
forgot.
So
Thank you for that.
yes, so they turn away from. They take their first. It'd be like us taking our first right.
Taking a right hand turn over here.
And
Yes,
just to
yes.
let the person they're pursuing know, I'm not pursuing you anymore. I've not only
We're
slowed down,
done
I've
with
turned off
this.
the road. We're done. You can slow
Yes.
down so that you're not hurting anybody.
Right. Right.
And he said, in the last, I think he said 18 months or something like that, he said, we've had 3 different incidents where a supervisor in the command center said, terminate the pursuit, and the driver didn't. And they've ended in a crash of some kind.
Collisions.
No
Yeah. Yeah.
fatalities, nothing bad, but just like,
Mm-hmm.
we told you to stop and you didn't.
Right.
And he said, I personally talked to all 3, and I know 2 of them, and all 3 of them said, we did not hear the supervisor tell us to terminate the pursuit. They had been in conversation, radio talk up to that point and after that point. But they said
This
that
is
one
my
point was
story exactly.
I'm
This
retelling your
it's not
story.
just me.
It's not
Okay.
just you.
Okay.
This is how brains work. So
Vindication is coming. I can feel it.
so I said, hey, and so he said, my question is, did they really hear that supervisor or not? And
Mm-hmm.
I said, I have my beliefs on that, but I don't want to give beliefs. Why don't we do a research project and find out? And if you'll let me come over and do the research, that'll be one of my projects. And so at the driving school, besides driving with the public, they also have this big circle, concrete circle that slopes, kind of slants gently to the middle. And there's a big drain in the middle. And then all the way around it. And I don't even know how to tell how large it is. Is it maybe 30 yards across or 20 yards across? I don't know, 60, 70 feet, something like that, across
Mm-hmm.
this circle. And there's little spigots in the curbing all around it that just drip water down through. Well, more than drip, just a small steady stream of water runs down through it. and each morning they pour oil on it and then let that water run over it. So it becomes a very slick surface. It's sloped towards the middle, and the curbing is more of a slant, a really sharp slant, so that if you slide up to the curb, you kind of go up on that embankment and then slide back down onto what they call the skid pan. So they
Skid
want to
pan.
teach,
Yep.
their drivers how to maintain control. So I'm starting to lose control. How do I maintain, And so I said, why don't we do a study where we have officers listening to two different tones, a high and a low tone, and they have to, in their mind, discriminate between them and only count the high tones. And it beeped only like 15% of the time. And then I'll measure brain activity to show that. And I was thinking, man, this is probably too simple because you're driving at like 10 miles an hour in a circle.
Mm-hmm.
But they allowed us to do this, but they said an instructor has to be in the car with them while they do it, just because that's policy. And I said, yeah, that's fine. So the police officer who was there as a student to learn to drive would get in the car. I would sit behind them again with the laptop and EEG and measure the brain activity while these beeps are going off, and then have them count. And at the end of a series of beeps, I would say, how many high tones did you hear? And they would tell me, and then they'd run the next series, and they would do about 4 series each. And the very first guy that got in, when he went, we put the cap on outside of the car, and it has this band of the 40 wires are kind of tied together into this connection device at the end. So they hold onto that and they carry it. When he sits down, he passes that to me over the seat, and then I plug it into the EEG. And when he went to hand it to me, it was shaking really bad, like up and down. And one thing I learned about the officers in the UK, they have a great sense of humor, but kind of a dry sense of humor. And they really like, just like officers here in the States, they really like picking on academics. And so they would tease me a lot. So he went to hand it to me, and I thought, oh, this is him being funny. So I kind of laughed, oh, yeah, good one, thank you. And I plugged it in, and when I plugged it in, his EEG was like off the charts. His heart rate was high. We were measuring heart rate. And when he was driving, he couldn't count the number of high tones. He was under so much stress. He couldn't discriminate between high and low.
I want to go back for just a second because my schema kicked in based on my background. I'm thinking of a new recruit going to EVOC, and that is not what we're talking about. These are veteran officers who were selected through what I'm assuming is a highly competitive process, yes, identified as the highest probability of being successful as a pursuit driver.
Most of them are in their early 30s.
Right. So these are experienced officers. Yes. Okay. So I feel like since I just fell into that trap, I wanted to make sure nobody listening falls into that trap. These are veteran cops, a lot of experience, selected to go through this program. And still, you have, say that again, his heart rate is high. What else?
Yeah, and his he couldn't discriminate between the two tones. When I would say
between high and low.
Yes, between high and low.
Yeah.
And at the end, I would say, how many high tones did you hear? And he's supposed to say like 8 or 9. Mm-hmm. And the first time I asked, he just kept driving. And the instructor kind of looked at him and then kind of glanced at me. So I leaned up and I said it even louder, like, how many high tones did you hear? And there was still a pause. And then he went, 48. I'm like, 40. And the instructor like looked at him like, what? Because the answer is supposed to be like 9.
And there's 8 or 9. And he said 48.
He's like, 48. And I said, okay. And just remember, you're supposed to be counting the high tones and ignoring the low ones. He said, I am. I said, okay. So we went through, he wasn't getting any of them right. His heart rate at a couple of points, it was like steady around 160 beats a minute, which is really
high. A little high. Yeah.
And there were periods of, 15 to 20 seconds where it was over 200 beats a minute, like near cardiac arrest, sitting in a car, driving at 10 miles an hour, kind of sliding to the left and right. And I'm really naive. I was going, I don't know what is happening with it. What is going on? Because I didn't expect any. I thought this was going to be. To me, that looks fun. I was like, oh man, I'd like to do this. That looks fun. Why aren't these officers having fun doing this? So afterwards, when we're taking the cap off, and it's just me and a couple of researchers and the officer, I was like, you seemed a little stressed out there. And he's like, yeah. And I said, well, why were you stressed? It seems like a fun task. Why were you stressed? And he said, because the instructor was in the car with me. And I said, but the instructor even told you at the beginning that he wasn't evaluating you today. And he said, right. And he might not have been evaluating me today, but if I really screwed that up, then he'll remember that like later this week when I'm on the skid pan for real. And that's going to influence how he evaluates me at that point. And I can't fail this course and go back to my family and say, yeah, I couldn't cut it. So there was so much stress and pressure put on them that I feel bad that I was so naive that I didn't catch that. But
And the only reason the instructor was in the car was because of the policy.
just because of the
The
policy,
policy said if they're on the skid pan, they have to have an instructor. But
yes,
that ramped him up, this officer up so much stress wise that you got to see all of these effects.
all of these effects. And the instructor would say when they got in, just so you know, I'm here to observe as part of I have to be in the car today, but I'm not evaluating you. But this, scientist from America sitting in the back seat wants to do this for some reason. So we've agreed. So, and one of the things they did do, which it made me feel better, is they told this was volunteer by these officers. They could say, I don't want to do the study, and that was fine. So they had to volunteer to participate. But I got them to agree that if any officer failed the training, not the research, but failed the 4 weeks of training they were going to go through, that they would give them a second chance, which they wouldn't do. I mean, initially, if you fail, if you're out, you don't get a second chance.
Yes. Yeah.
So I said, for this group, for anybody who volunteers, will you give them a second chance? And they were like, man, that's a lot of it. And I can't add the stress of research onto them. And then they think it's the research that made them fail, which it might have been. It might have been the stress from the research. So they eventually said, yes, we'll do that. So they told all the officers, if you volunteer and you don't pass, then we'll let you go through this course again, because it might have been the research of why you didn't pass. And so I was looking at those sounds to get back to your question of did the officers really hear or not? And I'll just go back to say, I asked the assistant commissioner, I said, what do you think? Do you think that they heard the supervisor at the command center? And he said, I personally don't think they did, because I know these people. I believe them when they say I didn't hear them. But he said, I'm in the minority. Most of the command staff and their the instructors and different ones say yes, they heard. They just had ego stress, what they called ego stress, and they said it's like red mist. Like, how dare you run from me? I'm going to catch you. I'm not going to stop this pursuit, even if somebody tells me to, because I'm angry with you. But he said, I don't think that was it. I don't think they heard. And so I asked the instructors at the academy, because I thought, they're definitely going to be on the driver's side on this, because they probably experienced something similar. So I asked them, and they were like, oh no, they heard. They just didn't want to stop. I was like, really?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and then I said, really? And they said, yes, because we train them to a level where they can do both. They can pursue and listen to the radio. I was like, oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So to cut to the chase, there were some officers that were able to do pretty well in counting the beeps, and a few that weren't. That, by the way, a side note, there were, out of the 8 of this first group that we tested, 2 of them were really bad at it, and they both failed the overall course, and they got a chance to come back a second time. The 6 that passed also were able to drive on the skid pan and listen, but none of them were 100% accurate on the beeps. They were still off. Right. I tested the instructors, and they were all at 100%. So they were able to listen and drive. None of the students were able to hit 100%, which was surprising to me. But I was asking them, why do you think that, like, instead of saying, like, how many high tones did you hear, you said 11 when it was 9? I mean, that was close, but why do you think you were off? And they said, while I was driving, I felt that I was starting to lose control of the car. So all of my focus went into regaining control and reestablishing that. And once I got it back where I was in control again, I would hear a beep and go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be counting beeps. I have no idea how many I missed. So I'll just add 1 or 2 and keep my count going. And so when I went back and looked at the brain activity around each beep and the errors and the beeps and things, you could just see the difference in brain activity, that they weren't hearing the beeps at that time. And also behaviorally, they were saying, I didn't hear it. And then we were looking at brain activity and the brain didn't hear it. And so the result we came up with was officers could listen to that. So if like you driving, talking on your radio, you're able to ride and watch and do all of that. But if things get like hairy all of a sudden, like maybe you see a school where there's potentially school children, or you see a car pulling up from a side road, like coming up fast to stop, and you think they might pull out in front of us, or there might be a kid or whatever, that sense of control you have leaves like, oh no, something bad could happen right here. So all of your focus goes to the situation at hand. And that's when you miss auditory information. That's when you miss commands over the radio. Once you get past that situation, you can start listening again. So it's you listen until the stress gets really high, and then you don't for a second until you're back under control, and then you listen again. So I definitely believe that you did not hear the question of what was the crime because of the stress in the car from the pursuit stress.
Thank you for that. That makes me feel better. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into this because in all of these examples we're talking about, so I want to tie all of this together. We have 5 senses that we rely on to take information in from the outside world. And so we're talking about auditory, right? So what I can hear, but there's other instances of these things being disrupted under stress. And so I'm trying to understand, like, there's things going on. Normally I can take information in and process it. That my on channel, right, can go, this is what's going on. But then as maybe stress, whatever kind of stress, which we'll talk about hopefully coming up, but stress then can affect what I'm aware of, what I'm paying attention to. So how can you explain that a little bit deeper, just that little piece?
Yeah. And I'd like to use another analogy. So I used the cable television or the police radio last time. This is
and that was helpful.
Good. This is a favorite of cognitive psychologists. It's the iceberg to explain the brain. So imagine your brain is an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg, the part of the ice sticking out of the water, is the on channel. That's your conscious awareness of, what's happening around you. That's the information that you're aware of. And then under that water line, the big chunk of ice underwater is your non-conscious back channel brain. And so everything we talked about last time that the non-conscious brain is taking care of, like instincts, drives, schemas, patterns, all of those things are taken care of underwater in the iceberg analogy. And your tip of the iceberg is what you're aware of. So now if you kind of picture that in your mind, think about the water level as what determines what you are and are not aware of. So it kind of does 2 things. The water level divides awareness between the on channel and the back channel, and it also divides which of the channels is exerting the most control over your behaviors at the time. So remember, behaviors originate in the back channel, and they kind of get pushed forward as urges and impulses, and then your on channel decides to override or redirect or let those go through. And so if the water level starts to rise and get higher, so it looks like the iceberg's being pulled underwater further and further, then that means less awareness for the on channel and more control for the back channel, because that water level divides awareness and control. Does that make sense?
It does. So, but for me, I'm picturing the smallest part of an iceberg is my on channel, and that's sitting above the water, and there's not much of it up there. Right. Based on what we talked about in the last episode, when you said how much of that big chunk of ice under the water runs my day to day, which, I wasn't really comfortable with that idea, but I understand it. How much of that under that water line is running my day, making decisions, driving, all that. But now you're talking about something. And I think what you're saying, if I can tie them together, is that in this instance, we're talking about stress. Stress is the
Yes.
thing that's making the water level rise.
Yes.
And there's less of that, the tip of the iceberg, which, everything's normal and fine. The water line is there. But as stress is pulling that iceberg underwater, now there's just a little bit of the tip of that iceberg sticking up above the water line.
Yes. And that now your brain has fewer resources to process information. And so now it has to decide, I can't do all the work I normally do. The on channel can't do the work it normally does. So your brain is wired to give preference to visual information. So I know you've heard of some of these terms as a police officer, but as the water level goes up, that means the on channel has fewer resources to understand what's happening around it. So it prioritizes vision. And so it a lot of times will cut off hearing. So it's called auditory exclusion, is what you call it in law enforcement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so could you
Yeah.
explain it real quick, what auditory exclusion is?
Well, yeah, I think this is what we're talking about, in that the water level starts to rise, and you just said vision is our primary source of information, usually. And so if I have to devote, let's say I have a certain percentage of information available, and just if you think about, I have to devote that to vision because that's how we're wired. There isn't enough left over for what I'm smelling, what I'm tasting, what I'm hearing,
But
all
what's
of
that
those
like
things.
as an officer? Like if you have auditory
I
exclusion, what's it like?
Yeah, but then also, so I described it in that pursuit, but I have heard stories of officers in situations where their partner is right next to them, yelling in their ear, and they say they never heard that.
Right,
So to
right.
that degree, if the water level goes up high enough, there's these instances of you. And I'm trying to be careful how I say it, because I would ask you, am I not hearing that? Or is that the right way to say it? Or is my brain just not processing that? There's noise coming in through the ear canal. It vibrates my eardrum, right? All those things I think are still happening.
Yes, yeah.
But
And you're back.
so when I say I don't hear it, is that accurate? Or is there a better way to say that?
Yeah, well, I think that's accurate enough because you're not consciously
Okay.
aware of it. You're not consciously
Yes.
aware that somebody's
Yeah.
hollering. Now your back channel's processing that information, and there's research to show, and I've done some similar research where you can show that the signal at the sensory system is still there. It's just your attentional system doesn't process it, and the attentional system is a on-channel task. So auditory exclusion, like you said, somebody can be standing right beside you yelling, you don't hear it. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also out of the you know your vision is prioritized, but now you don't have enough resources to process your whole visual field. So your brain prioritizes what's right in front of you, what falls on what's called the fovea of the eye, the area of eye that's the most focused. So now it's like you can see what's right in front of you, but all your periphery is lost. So somebody can walk
Right.
up in the periphery, and officers will say, I didn't see them walk up. And so that's called tunnel vision. So you have auditory
Yeah, in law
exclusion.
enforcement, we call that tunnel vision,
Mm-hmm.
where we're focused on. So I was always taught or told and believed that we focus in on the threat, again, air quotes implied, but you're saying it's actually more of the anatomy of the eye that dictates what
Well,
the tunnel vision.
so the anatomy of the eye says I can only process this percentage, like 10% of the visual field. But then,
Mm-hmm.
something that's important will draw that. So if it's a weapon, that 10% is used to look right at the weapon because that is the
Okay, so
threat.
that is accurate then. What I've been taught, what I
Yes.
believed is accurate. Okay,
Yeah, so
good.
you can see that
Good.
weapon, and I think that I've
Yeah.
seen this when I've gone to doing research with law enforcement, when I've gone to the shooting range where they've had active scenarios where officers will move down the range with live fire and like come around a corner, and there'll be paper targets of people, and it'll be like people holding guns towards other people or something like that, and or
Mm-hmm.
towards the officer, and the shot pattern a lot of time is around the hand and the gun instead of at the person, because of stress they focused in just on that weapon, and that's what they shot at instead of the person.
I've seen that. I've heard that and seen that as well on the range. Yeah,
Okay, so
that makes
that's where your
sense.
focus goes. But there's more
Yeah.
than just tunnel vision and auditory exclusion. There's also time distortions because your on channel keeps track of time. And if you remember last time we were talking in the last podcast, I said the back channel is not good at sequencing events and saying I've got to do
Mm-hmm.
this certain sequence or keep this line of events. The back channel doesn't do that sequencing of that kind. It just says these are the things that happen. And so an officer later will get mixed up on what happened first, second, or third because their water level was so high they weren't processing that information. So stress, and there's different types of stress. What we're talking about right now is sometimes referred to as survival stress, which is
Right.
threat of harm or threat of life. And so that
Yeah.
causes all of these changes in the brain, and the brain starts prioritizing things for survival that you may not, that would work for somebody like me that gets put in a stressful situation. It would be good if I would focus on one thing, or run or do whatever as a
Mm-hmm.
just a citizen, as a human being. My brain's wired to help me survive. Police officers have those same brains, but they've been told, but you can't do things that your brain is telling you to do. You've got to do things differently because now you're a police officer and you have a weapon and a badge, and so you have to do things differently. But then under stress, when the water level goes up, they can't always remember what they're supposed to do differently. I can't remember the policies and procedures because my on channel's underwater. And there's instances where people will go completely underwater. And that's when somebody says, I blacked out and don't remember anything. But the videos
Yeah.
show, no, you didn't black, you were still acting and doing whatever you had to do. It just means I don't have any memory of that because the water level went above the iceberg. Now my back channel brain is in control of all of my actions.
So in this analogy, it's possible for, I think what I just heard you say is that the water level in hopefully rare instances, but can actually completely sink the ice, like the iceberg is completely underwater. There is no part of the iceberg still above water.
It can get that way. So the water level will move incrementally the more stress you're under, and the more stress and the more stress. And then if it all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm up against it, I could die right here, right now, it's probably going to go all the way underwater. And then your back channel's trying to
Oh,
help you survive. And these
okay.
are instances of acute stress. So that's like your example driving the car. That's acute stress, meaning it's for the moment, but then that moment passes and the water level comes back down.
Yeah.
There's
And
also
I want to get deep into stress in the next episode, like all
okay.
the different kinds of stress. Because I feel like, and if you tell me if you agree with this, but I think that stress does deserve more time to delineate between the different types, why we actually feel those things, and we can talk about its effect on the iceberg. But because I wanted to ask another question because we're running short on your time, and I want to be respectful of that. But you said stress can affect the water level,
Mm-hmm.
right, or raise the water level.
Yep.
Are there any things other than stress that can raise the water level, or is it just stress that does it?
No, there's other things. And I agree with you that we should probably spend some time on this because there's so much to learn about stress and the iceberg and how it affects us and it affects our health and,
Yeah,
physical health, mental health, emotional health,
absolutely.
all of these things that for people that aren't police officers like me, it's still important to understand stress and the water level and how at work, you as you start to get under stress because deadlines and pressure coming up, and then you bark at somebody or yell, and then that
Yep.
can
Yep.
hinder you. So I do want to get more into that. But your
Yeah.
question was, what are some other things? It's we were
Other
talking
than
about
stress, what raises the water level? Yeah.
distracted driving in the last episode. That's just
Yeah.
your inattentiveness. I'm thinking about other things. I'm talking to my wife about as a story that's going on. If you're in your head and you're not like present in the moment of what's happening around you, that means your water level is up. So it's not always caused by a bad thing like stress. It could just be I'm really engrossed in this conversation, so I'm less likely to notice things happening around me. That's because my water level's up. I'm focusing most of my attention on this conversation. It could be cognitive load, which is when you're trying to do too many things at once and like balance and juggle your attention and all of that, that can cause the water level to go up. So there's different things that can raise the water level, and we should talk about that some more. You're right.
Yeah, yeah. But so you just said cognitive load, but that's like what a lot of people call multitasking, right? Which I don't, technically you can't really multitask. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And multitasking is one type of cognitive load. And
Oh, okay.
and our system's set up where it really it feels like you're doing multiple things at once. But if you look at the brain and how it's processing information, it's actually attentional shifting. It's shifting back and forth between multiple things very quickly, and it's happening so quickly that you're not realizing all the different attentional shifting going on. So it feels like you're doing multiple things at once, but you're really focused on one thing, and then you shift over to the other thing real quick, and then you shift to maybe a third thing, and then you shift back to the first thing, and so your attention's moving
Okay.
around. And a good way to see this is if you watch television, and maybe it's a news show, and you try to listen to what the news anchor or whoever's talking, what they're saying, and read the story along the bottom ticker, because it's usually a different story, and
Uh-huh.
watch the
Yep.
ball game, the sports scores on the top right or whatever. Try to just do all of that at once. And what you'll realize what you're doing is I'm hearing a few words they're saying, and then I look down and try to pick up a few words I'm reading. Then I go back and listen to that person and pick up some more words. And you're shifting back and forth to try to process it all at once. And then pretty soon, if anything else distracts you, or if you're tired or whatever, all of a sudden you go, oh, I just lost both stories. I don't know either one, what's happening in either one. So that's cognitive. That's an example of cognitive load.
Yeah, so there's no stress involved. I'm sitting on my couch, but me trying to do, like you just said, I'm trying to watch the ticker, listen to the anchor, look at the sports score, and then something else happens in the room that my water level is rising because I'm trying to do all those things.
Yeah,
Is that accurate?
it is accurate. You may be frustrated, but it's not, and you may not be, but
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
stress like survival stress, like threat of harm.
Right.
It's just I got too much going on right now, and just think about your daily life, how many things you have going on in your life.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
That's just life.
That was informative. Thank you for that, for all of that, actually. But I want to just take just a couple of minutes here for the final segment. I have a question about a brain myth
Okay.
that I'm really interested in right now, and that's it's about intelligence and IQ tests, right? So,
Okay.
number one, can I just ask what is the, and maybe not the dictionary definition, but what is the definition of intelligence? What does it mean?
That that's a good question. You're going to get different answers again from different people, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
thought
I
of
didn't want to pin
now.
you down on it, but
Yeah, yeah.
for this
It's
question,
okay.
what do
So
you got?
I think that intelligence, like most of us think of, like an IQ test and that type of intelligence,
Hmm.
you say somebody's smart. It's looking at fluid intelligence, and it's kind of how you can do the things you need to do through a day, and how much, how well you're able to get through your day. And initially, IQ tests were not really about fluid intelligence. They were more about information. So they would say, okay, for a person that's really smart, they need to be able to understand words and the meaning of words. They need to be able to read and comprehend what they're reading. And so you have people that are very verbal, and they can score high on IQ tests. And then there's also part of
Hmm.
it, yeah, but there's also this math side and logic and reasoning around math and numbers, and being able to understand that, and people that are smart can do that. So then there's that part of the test. And they really designed a test, the IQ test, based on kind of what our society, our white society, felt was the most important things, to the most important skills to have to be considered smart. And it really ended up missing the mark, because if you were raised in American society as a white person and had access to everything that we did, then it might be a fairly accurate measurement of intelligence. But if you didn't have all of the privileges and access and things like that, then it would just automatically score you lower. So it was saying, yeah, you're not as intelligent because you don't have access
Mm-hmm.
to the same system. And there was some really interesting study that was done in Australia back in the 1960s, I think. But one of the researchers there, they were having issues because the IQ tests were prioritizing white Australians like it did here in the U.S., but it was really showing that all of the like Aboriginal children in school always scored really low. And so the thought
Okay.
was, well, they're not smart. I mean, we just know
Mm-hmm.
they're just not smart. So a researcher came in and created a test where they had a big white kind of poster board and they put pieces of tape on it to divide it into squares, like 12 squares, 16 squares, 20 squares. And they would take like a rock, a leaf, a little stick. They would take things from the environment and put it in some of those boxes, or even sometimes all of those boxes, and they would have that covered. And the child would come up, like 8 or 10 year old child, and they would remove the covering for 20 seconds or whatever, and then put it back. And then they would have slide all those items off that board, and then say, "Can you replace these items?" And
Okay.
the
Okay.
white Australian children would put a few back, two or three or four maybe, and they found the Aboriginal children were a lot of times would put all of them in the correct spaces. And in fact, they would even, if the rock goes in row 2, line 4, they would set it there, and they would even turn the rock to where it was facing the same way it was when they
The
saw
way
it.
it was before. Yeah.
Yeah, or spin
Yeah.
a leaf or something. And it was
Mm-hmm.
because their spatial knowledge and spatial intelligence, spatial knowledge was really important to them because they were hunting, they were looking for things, they were having to go on trips, find their way back. So all of these signs from the environment were really important to them. So their brain was like, we got to know where rocks are, where landmarks are. If a leaf is bent in a certain way, maybe an animal stepped on it. So those things are important. They were very good at that kind of stuff. They just weren't as good at the standard intelligence tests. So that's when
Right.
people are like, you know what, the intelligence test doesn't really measure intelligence. Intelligence is how well your brain adapts to the situation it's in. So I would say intelligence tests are more like book smart, and then there's street smarts, which is kind of how your brain
Mm-hmm.
adapts and understands. And if your brain's flexible and it can fit into a new situation, that means you're pretty intelligent.
So you kind of mentioned this before about forgetting your passport and the like, but take you out of it. But there's people. Is it fair to say there's people who would score very high on an intelligence test, but they can't find their glasses when they're sitting on top of their head?
That's
Like,
exactly right. So usually if
so
somebody doesn't score high on a test, they have other things they score high on. Like then they can find their
right,
glasses. Then there's some people that don't score high on a test and can't find their glasses and forget their passport. They just don't score high in any area. So there's also that.
right. Well, but we're back to what you said in the last episode about the brain, and maybe I'm missing the mark here, but the brain is always asking, is this important? Are we going to do this a lot? And whatever you are saying yes to, and by saying yes, it's by doing, but whatever you're telling your brain, this is really important. Like you said, we're hunters. I need to know landmarks. I need to know those things. That becomes important to the brain. And so if you test someone who has told their brain this is important on that area, they're going to score high,
Yeah.
as
And then
opposed to math or language or any of the other things that you brought up.
and I'm sure that I know there's differences. Like in the example I gave with the Aboriginal children, some were better at placing the rocks and the leaves, and so in that case, they were a little bit smarter than the others. And on
Right.
IQ tests, some score higher on verbal than others, or some score higher in math than others. So there's differences in that. But if you just look at it as a system, the IQ test is not a good way to tell if somebody's smart or not, because there's
Right.
so
So
many
the
other.
IQ test does not measure intelligence, is what you're saying.
I am saying that it does not do a good job of measuring intelligence. It can measure verbal ability, but shouldn't be tied strictly to
To
intelligence.
intelligence. Right. Another brain myth debunked. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Okay. So thank you so much for your time today. That was really informative. And I'll
Good. I
see you again
enjoyed it.
next week.
Thank you. Talk
Thank
later,
you,
Sean.
John.
All right. Bye.
Okay.